Hey there, let's talk about soil air. You might think it's about the same as the stuff that we breathe above the ground, but you'd be mistaken. Soil air is actually quite different from the stuff that's above. And the main difference is, even though right here the relative humidity is also quite high, maybe 70%, the relative humidity in the soil is almost always completely water saturated, even when soil is so dry that basically plants permanently wilt. The relative humidity in the soil is still super high. That's because soil is just a vast internal surface, so everything basically evaporates from all the surfaces, and also there's simply no wind, so it's basically just quite stagnant. And in all of the myriad of pores of which soil consists of, there's basically just water saturated atmosphere. That's one big difference. And of course, organisms are adapted to this, living in basically almost always 100% relative humidity. The other big difference is the carbon dioxide concentration. And the carbon dioxide concentration is also several fold higher, basically about maybe an order of magnitude higher than it is above ground, where it's about maybe 420 or so parts per million or microliters per liter. And the CO2 concentration in the soil is very, very much higher. And why is that? Well, that is basically for a similar reason than when we discussed the soil moisture. There's no wind. So basically CO2 that's being produced by respiration of all the organisms that live in the soil is just not effectively being vented from the soil, but it just stays there and just is removed very, very slowly by diffusion, very gradually. And so since basically everything in soil respires, including roots and all the microbes and all the animals, there's just so much CO2 being produced that's not efficiently basically vented to the outside. It is, of course, eventually coming out. This is what we measure as soil respiration. But in the meantime, it's just all enriched in the soil atmosphere. That's important to understand because elevated atmospheric CO2 in the atmosphere above ground is a major factor of global change affecting plants directly, for example. But since the CO2 concentration in the soil atmosphere is already very, very high, basically that factor doesn't have any repercussions for the soil CO2 concentration in the atmosphere down there. For similar reasons, the oxygen concentration is also slightly lower than the oxygen concentration above ground. But since we have a lot more oxygen in the atmosphere, thank goodness, than CO2, generally speaking, the relative difference is just not as remarkable as it is for carbon dioxide. And maybe a final point to make is that the local concentration differences can be quite significant and also can contain information. For example, if you are a mycorrhizal fungus and you're a spore and you suddenly sense a higher CO2 concentration in your environment, that may mean that you're actually now close to a respiring root and that therefore it would be a good moment to germinate and grow towards it and then try to colonize it. So there are very local gradients in gas concentrations, which is also rather unusual. That is also because there is not much mixing, and therefore you have this creation of concentration gradients, even of something that's relatively mobile, such as a gas. Yeah, and I think that about sums up the most important things to know about the soil atmosphere. It's quite different from above ground, and it's kind of interesting to think about what life in the soil is like given these conditions. And with that, see ya. Bye.